What you have just seen is the overview of a generic plan space search planner. The reason why we've looked at the overview first is so that you could recognize the generic search structure that underlies this algorithm. Now we will look at some of the implementation details that come with this algorithm and that were hidden in the function used by the generic algorithm. The first function used by the plan space planner is the function that extracts the open goals from a given plan. And instead of computing these open goals afresh every time we go through the loop, we will do this incrementally. We start off with our initial plan pi0 that has just the two dummy actions in it and goal. And the question now is, what are the unachieved sub-goals in this initial plan? And the answer is simply that these are the goal conditions that are the preconditions of the goal dummy action. So the goal conditions from our planning problem are our initial unachieved sub-goals. Then we have to modify this set when we do one of two things. When we add an action to the plan, we have to add all the action's preconditions as unachieved sub-goals to our set. So we increase the set of unachieved sub-goals every time we add an action to our partial plan. And when we add a causal link, we decrease the set of unachieved sub-goals. And we decrease it by the proposition that is now protected in this causal link and is no longer unachieved. This precondition of an action is now supported by a causal link and is no longer an unachieved sub-goal. Next, we have to compute the threads that exist in our current partial plan. And again, we will do this incrementally rather than compute them every time we go through the loop. And we start with our initial plan pi0 that simply contains no threads, so that is very easy to compute. The other cases are a little more complex. New threads can be introduced into our plan every time we add an action to our plan. So suppose we're adding our action A new to our plan consisting of the usual things. Then what we have to do is follow this procedure to check whether a new thread has been introduced with this action. The way we do this is we go through every causal link that is currently in our plan, and we have a loop variable here that represents this causal link as going from AI to AJ, protecting proposition P. And for every such link, we have to check the following. The first one is we check whether our new action is already ordered before AI or after AJ. So if the new action is before the provider or after the consumer, that means it cannot be in parallel to our causal link, which means it cannot threaten that causal link, and we can just simply continue with the loop, go to the next link. Otherwise, that means the action can be in parallel to our link. It needn't necessarily, but it can be. And then we have to check every effect Q of our new action. And if there is such an effect Q that can be unified with P such that Q and not P are equal, or Q and P are complementary, then, and only then, is Q of A new a threat for our causal link. Of course, this only applies if this substitution is actually consistent with our binding constraints. So this was the case where a newly introduced action may threaten an existing causal link in our partial plan. The other way where we can add new threads to our partial plan is when we add a causal link from AI to AJ protecting proposition P to our current partial plan. And when we add this new causal link to the plan, this may be threatened by any action that is already in the plan. So what we've got to do is we've got to loop over all the old actions in our plan that already existed in our plan and check whether they pose a threat. Again, if this existing action is either before the provider or after the consumer, then this action cannot be a threat. And there's a third condition here, namely that our existing action is the consumer in our causal link. Of course, the consumer of a causal link cannot threaten that causal link. So, if one of these three conditions hold, we can go to the next action, because this existing action we're currently observing cannot possibly be a threat to the newly introduced causal link. Otherwise, we have to observe all the effects of our existing action and do what we did before. We've got to see whether this is unifiable with our protected proposition, and if this is the case, if these two can be made complementary by some substitution that is consistent with our binding constraints, then we have the case where the effect Q of our existing action, AOLD, threatens our newly introduced causal link from AI to AJ, protecting proposition P. In summary, we have no threats initially, but every time we add an action to the plan, that means we can threaten an existing causal link with this new action, and every time we add a causal link to this plan, to the partial plan, then this may be threatened by an existing action that is already in the plan. Now that we have detected the two types of potential flaws that can exist in a partial plan, we need to look at the function that can remove these flaws, and this is this function here, getResolvers. A resolver is a way of removing a flaw from a plan. And we will first look at the flaw that is an unachieved precondition in our partial plan, and we will consider the precondition P of action AG. And there are two principal ways in which this type of flaw can be removed from the plan, in which way it can be resolved. Namely, by adding a causal link and by adding a new action and a causal link. Let's start with the causal link alone. This is a causal link to an existing action. So what we've got to do is see whether there's an existing action in our plan. So we go through all our existing actions in the plan to check whether they can be a provider for this unsupported precondition. The first condition then is that we have to make sure that our existing action can be ordered before the consumer, and the consumer of course is AJ in this case. So if our existing action is the consumer, or it is already ordered after the consumer, then we cannot use it as a provider because it cannot come before the consumer, so we can just consider the next action. Otherwise, if it may come before the consumer, then we've got to check every effect Q of our existing action to see whether this can be used as a provider. And again, what we do is we try to find a substitution consistent with our variable binding constraints such that P and Q are equal. If we can find such a substitution, then adding a causal link to our plan is a resolver for this threat. And the causal link we need to add is from our currently existing action to our consumer, protecting the link sigma of P. So we instantiate our proposition with the substitution we just found. This was the case where we used an existing action in our plan to provide support for an unachieved precondition. The alternative is, of course, that we introduce a new action into our plan that supports our unachieved precondition. And to check whether this is possible, we've got to loop over all the operators in our planning domain and check every effect Q of every operator to see whether this can be used as a provider. The first step is that we look for a substitution sigma that makes P and Q equal. Note that we don't have to worry about the variable binding constraints in this case, because all the variables in Q that we've just introduced with the new operator are of course new variables and have no bindings yet. If we find such an operator, then we use an instance of this operator as a new action in our plan. So this is the new action we need to add to the plan. And we also need to add a causal link to the plan. And this causal link consists of the link from a new, the provider of the action we've just introduced, to our consumer, AG. And again, we protect the condition sigma of P, the instantiated proposition that is an unachieved precondition of AG. And these two things together provide our resolver. So, if our flaw is an unachieved precondition, we can remove this flaw by either adding a causal link from an existing action, or we add a new action and a causal link from that new action to our unachieved precondition. Now let's look at the case where we have an action AT that is threatening a causal link AI to AJ protecting proposition P. And let's see how we can get resolvers that remove this type of flaw from our partial plan. For an action to be a threat to a causal link, it must be at least potentially in parallel to that causal link. So one way to remove this type of flaw is to simply order the action either before or after the causal link. And we can order the action before the threatened link under two conditions. The first one is that the threat must not be the provider, and the second is that it must not be already after the consumer. If neither of these two holds, then we can add an ordering AT before AI, and that is a resolver for our threat. The other ordering that resolves this threat is to have the action come after the causal link or the causal link before the action. However, if our threatening action is the provider in our causal link, then we cannot use it. Or similarly, if the action is already ordered before the provider, then we cannot order it after the causal link. In all other cases, ordering our threatening action after the consumer is a resolver for this type of flaw. The other way in which this type of flaw can be resolved is to add variable bindings such that the unifications that we computed earlier will fail. And here is how we can do that. Remember, it is the effect Q that threatens our proposition P here. So what we do is we go through every variable V that occurs in P or Q and try to make the unification fail on that variable. So if we computed earlier our substitution of V must be a specific value, sigma of V, then asserting that our variable V must not have this value is of course a potential resolver, but it is only a resolver if this is consistent with the variable bindings currently in our partial plan. If it is consistent, then this is a resolver. Adding this variable binding constraint is a resolver for our flaw. In summary, threads can be removed from a plan by either ordering the threatening action before or after the causal link, or extending the variable bindings such that unifications of the offending effect and the protected proposition fail.